Welcome to the Western Bell podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of this series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled, If You Don't Act Right, You Don't Feel Right. The talk was given by Matthew Files on April 27, 2024, via Zoom. Matthew facilitates groups that support people to look deeper into their process, formulate their own questions, and become responsible for their choices. In this talk, he speaks about maxims expressed in the Revolutionist Code of Conduct by Jan Cox, who was a teacher in the mystical and philosophical sense, who died in 2005. Matthew states that fresh insights and revelations can come from considering a different kind of language, such as that which Jan used, often with humor. He says that being a revolutionist is to struggle against sleep, our unconsciousness and mechanicality, which we tend to see in hindsight and can work with by relaxing and not being knotted up in our efforts. The maxims which are discussed and the depth of the considerations are not about morality, but are meant to point to a reality beyond words. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Matthew Files.
So, Jan Cox, I've known about Jan Cox for decades, long time. Met him once in Atlanta where he had a center. I think it's still there. I don't really know. Once I listened to him talk, I liked him a lot, mostly because of his use of language. That's one of the things that attracted me to this material I'm going to be working with tonight. Revolutionist Code of Conduct, written up by Jan. I'll just read a little something that he says. So he has a lot of maxims about the code of conduct. And he says, the following simple maxims are not part of some moralistic philosophy. They are part and parcel of what I have been recently talking about, which is if you don't act right, you don't feel right. They have to do with making your time and efforts profitable here. So if you don't act right, you don't feel right. I think everybody's probably pretty familiar with that. That when you're acting right, you feel good. You feel right. Actually, feeling good might not be the right word, but you feel right. There's a rightness about how you feel because of how you're acting. So anybody who's familiar with landmark education or EST, they have a saying, providing what's wanted and needed. And I have this opinion that we always know what's wanted and needed. Always. But we don't always act on it. They're very different things. And when we act on it, we feel right. There's a knowing of acting right. It's the knowing that you've provided what's wanted and needed. So to me, that's, you could say, the trademark of a revolutionary. I love his language. So he says this thing. This is from actually a different piece of writing. As one's attention can tire from repeated exposure to the same descriptions of the same scene over and over, in that calling something under investigation by a name other than its common one can aid in fresh insights and discoveries. And that's something I really appreciate about Jan. For me, his language is not familiar. He's not really talking about anything new. It's not new material. It's not like he discovered something that wasn't discovered 5,000 years ago by saints and sages of the day, but his language. If you just embed yourself with a particular kind of language and only that language, you kind of lose those fresh insights that can come from reading another language. So he says, one's attention can tire from repeated exposure to the same descriptions of the same scene over and over, in that calling something under investigation So what is it that's under investigation here? This is what's under investigation. And if we're always using the same language to describe that, then there's things that can be lost in that, insights and revelations that can be lost because we become a little bit dulled. It's a very interesting thing with a new language too, or language we haven't heard before. It's very common for someone hearing a new language to say, does that mean this? And rephrase it in the language they're familiar with. So somebody's talking maybe Hindu terminology, and somebody's a Buddhist and they don't know Hindu terminology, and they say, oh, is that like, and they use Buddhist terminology, rather than just hearing what's being said and listening to the language and the effect that the language is actually having on this, on all the centers, or as Jan says, all the circuits. So that's what really grabs me about him. And that's why I picked this material to work with tonight, because for me, it's unfamiliar language. And yet there's things that jump out at me that I understand immediately, even though it's a completely different language. And some of it I don't understand at all because the language is so foreign. And I just have to become more familiar with his language. So he has these maxims, pages and pages of these things. And they're really great. I'm going to just read through some of them very quickly. And then there's other ones. There's a whole nother section on this thing that he wrote where he goes into some detail about certain ones. What I'm going to do is read them and do a commentary. So these are his Revolutionist Code of Conduct. He says, never talk about things already done. Never talk about what you may do. Hurt not thy back whenever possible. Be secretly better than your religion. Rejoice only slightly at the reported injuries of hunters and fishermen. Some of these things are really funny because some of them I would say he's only half serious about. Do more than merely think about things that truly interest you. Always remember that everybody does what life tells them will be pleasurable and necessary. Which, when you think about it, that's a wide range of activity and action in there. And it may not look pleasurable to me, what someone else is doing, but it is to them. If you're ever asked what you believe, smile and say, everything. Seek privileged information, while likewise seeking to give out none about yourself. Always attempt to be thinking more than two things at once. Don't be cynical regarding how other people have fun, but always know where the back door is. Treat everyone's autobiography as fiction. Don't tell anyone seriously that you'll do something unless you will, or unless you fully don't mean to. Hug somebody when you want to, and don't give it a second thought. Don't even give it a first thought. Be the first to say hello and goodbye. Act as though you don't know the word envy. You can appear ordinary, but not common. It's an interesting distinction between the two words, often confused, I think, or often blended together. There's no need to be uncomfortable. If you must deal with relatives, treat them like foreign dignitaries. Dress with the latest fads, only if you can pull it off successfully. Don't discuss yesterday. Squelch any desire to mention habits abandoned or sights seen. Be judicious with any use of euphemisms, and do not speak in metaphors when you intend the literal. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Stephen Jenkinson. He wrote a book called Die Wise, and in that he talks about that very thing in terms of the way people speak in euphemisms about death. And they say, I lost my husband or my wife. Where? Under the couch? What they really mean is he died. Or Johnny says, what happened to Grandpa? Oh, he's gone to a better place. Well, he died. There's a hesitation to be literal around death. So there's lots of euphemisms that are used in place of that. Remember, secrecy is a good taste. That's all you need to know. Anything you must be talked into, you shouldn't be. All things, great and small, come to an end. Act as though you think of this constantly. Conduct yourself as though you were the first to discover that no one's perfect. That's a good one. I like that one. Like you just discovered, wow, nobody's perfect. What an awesome discovery that is. But I'm not the first one to ever discover that. Here's the good one. Say the word love only to those who really know what you mean. I read that and I went, the problem is, who the hell knows what that means anyway? Okay, that's the warm-up. Oh, here's another one. Thou shalt not whine. Set your behavior and other revolutionary matters free from the calculations of potential profit and loss. Okay, so I'm going to get into his commentaries a little bit. I thought I would start with the biggest one. This is the one he comments on the most, maybe just because it was first and he got tired, but I don't know, because this was all spoken in a talk that he did. This one was, don't steal, don't be deceitful, especially to friends, and double especially to anyone involved in this. So when he's giving this talk, he's talking to his students. He doesn't use the language spiritual work. He just calls it this. I really like that. For me, that kind of language just opens things up immensely. It's almost like the language of calling something spiritual work or even work on self. It's very limiting when you just say, especially to anyone involved in this. You surely realize that all religions and moral systems state some version of thou shalt not steal. I'm telling you, there is a molecular chemical basis for this. Stealing is one of the worst, one of the least profitable things you can do. Let me spell it out for you. If you have to look around to make sure nobody saw you do something, you're stealing. Not paying a debt, for example, is a form of stealing. I don't care what the circumstances are. If you try to avoid repayment of a debt, you are poisoning yourself, whether it's $1 or $10,000. If you avoid paying a debt, you are stealing. That is the worst possible bargain you could strike. So this thing about poisoning yourself. So his reference point is not ethics and morality about stealing. It's about how it affects your involvement in this. However you want to relate to that term, this. It affects that. That's his whole reference point. All that matters is that you personally feel even the tiniest bit that you're stealing. Let me put it in cruder terms. If you have to get an unlisted number, if you have to send letters back with moved and deceased written all over them, if you have to watch where you go because somebody might recognize you, you are engaging in theft and deceit. Forget the words. As always, they are simply smoke signals. They are a way for me to transmit my understanding of life to you through the medium of sound waves, in this case, in order to possibly affect in you an unusual molecular change. The reality is not in the words theft or deceit. Every religion in the world condemns those words. But what I intend goes far beyond that. There's a reality behind the words, and I'm telling you, don't steal. And everything he's talking about in here goes beyond the words. He's not talking about the words, all the things about the code of conduct. I mean, those are all words. And like he says, he's trying to transmit something via language. But it's not the words. We have to be able to hear those words without them immediately falling into some moralistic thing about lying and being deceitful and stealing and how wrong it is and everything our parents in the church told us about it. This activity has nothing to do with commandments. Oh yeah, the commandments, thou shalt not steal. Nevertheless, every one of the things I read from my list, even the ones that elicit a titter from the listeners, every single one is deadly serious. I'll go further than that. If you are free of the confines of the chemically based 3D consciousness common to all humanity, the reality behind everything on my list would seem obvious and natural to you. You would be extraordinary, though nobody would recognize you as such. You would be extraordinary because life wired you up in such a way that you have a personal opportunity to know that stealing is unprofitable. Not because it's against your religion or your culture, or because you have an ingrained subconscious memory of your father saying that he would tan your hide if he ever caught you stealing anything. Simply put, you don't do it because it's poison for someone attempting this. If you can feel the reality of this particular one-liner of mine, then you feel it in your very molecules. You then simply follow your own internal sense and refrain from stealing in the same manner that you refrain from brushing your teeth with paint thinner. No discussion is necessary. There is no need to seek out advice, nor is there any need to debate the issue. No amount of money is worth the cost of theft. And one thing we might consider is the varying levels of theft. So I'm pretty sure he's not just talking about shoplifting, or I was going to say pump gas and then drive off. Can't do that anymore. When you would pump your gas and then go in and pay for it, or set the pump back and then just go in and tell them it was $20 less than it actually was. Things like that. I think there's other ways of stealing, other levels of stealing, other dimensions of stealing. And then deceit. There's deceiving others, and then there's deceiving ourselves. So there's various facets to look at in the consideration.
What do you see as what he means by revolutionist? What are the characteristics of a revolutionist that you've gleaned from his material? And what do you think he's trying to transmit in this nonlinear way?
I think what he's calling a revolutionist is not being common, not being asleep. We could use that language. Oh, that reminds me. He has some great stuff about what it means to be asleep. I think most people are familiar with that language. To be asleep is to be forever caught in the middle of an out-of-body experience. It's a good one. Because if you're in your body and you know you're in your body, you're not asleep. To be asleep is to have your house full of strangers. To be asleep is to always have an explanation as to why you are not completely conscious. An explanation or an excuse. To be asleep is to be a storm at sea, even when the seas are calm. To be asleep is to have a whole load of answers and not a clue as to the real question. To be asleep is to chase after what the voices say rather than after the voices. I think there he's talking about the voices in our heads, the constant chatter, and the tendencies to chase after what the voices are saying rather than the voices themselves. Where are they coming from? What's the root of them? To be asleep is to have an excuse why you were not home when you were called. Have an excuse for not answering the phone. That's a very interesting thing because he said this when there were no cell phones. So you had a phone when you were at home. Now it's even worse because there's an expectation, I think, that you have your phone with you and you answer it because you have it with you. And you better have a good excuse why you didn't. To be asleep is to listen to yourself talk and believe that it means something. So to be a revolutionary is to attempt to not be asleep, to struggle against sleep, unconsciousness, being like the common man. Because using his language of being involved in this is not special, but it is unusual.
I think that most of us don't even really realize that we're so asleep. How do you track that? How are you able to see that you're asleep?
I think it's after the fact. Just using these as examples. To be asleep is to always have an explanation as to why you're not completely conscious. Somebody asks you, why aren't you completely conscious? And you give all this litany of reasons. And then you realize that you just did that and that you were asleep in the middle of that. You see it in hindsight. That's how I relate to that. For me, if I'm walking around going, am I asleep? Am I awake? Am I asleep? I'm completely distracted. Like there's no value in that conversation in my head.
How does a revolutionist struggle against sleep?
Well, okay, let's take what he was just talking about in terms of stealing and being deceitful. If you take something like that serious, it will be a struggle to not do that for the benefit of your involvement in this. It will be a struggle. And yet at the same time, that's a tricky word, to struggle. Because somehow it implies making these efforts, gnashing your teeth and steeling yourself against the invaders. And personally, I'd just rather relax about the whole thing. But it doesn't mean that the struggle isn't there. I don't know if you get that distinction I'm trying to make. There's the struggle that's given, the attempt at not stealing, not being deceitful and always falling short, or occasionally falling short or randomly falling short. It doesn't matter. Somewhere along the line, we fall short. So we can call that struggling to not be deceitful, struggling to live, to act like a revolutionary. So all these maxims that he's putting out, to take them seriously is to struggle to be a revolutionary. But I find the best approach to that struggle is to relax about the whole damn thing. Otherwise, it gets very messy and convoluted, and it makes things worse. The efforts, those like knotted up efforts. You should say, whether out loud or to yourself, geez, kid, I'm sorry, whenever you have to cause harm to some living thing. All of you should feel something regarding this, although the perception will vary from person to person. Some of you will think following this item is sort of silly, and others will tend to overdo it. You can only do the possible. From one viewpoint, you wreak destruction every time you take a step or draw a breath. It's simply a fact of life that you cause death to something as you live. Of course, something's going to crush and eat you eventually, But if you have to kill fleas to keep your dog healthy, or brush insects from your food, or break branches from trees, you should feel absolutely no sense of joy or sport about it. And you should literally say, geez, kid, I'm sorry. It's nothing personal. I'm sorry. Your personal intention should be that. If things were different, you would spare that life if possible. You should not take away any part of life without awareness that at this level, you are killing something. So I really enjoyed that one because, like you're saying, things like that happen. You have to kill the fleas on your dog so your dog's healthy, or kill the insects that are invading your cabinets, the ants that are coming into your house. And yet the language he's using makes it so impersonal. Geez, kid, I'm sorry. You're talking to bugs or something like that. You're doing landscaping in your yard and you have to get rid of some plants, even if they're weeds. You're killing something. You can either treat it really callously. There's definitely extremes, it's just freaking weeds, who cares? Or it's like, oh my God, I'm killing this precious form of life and it's really important. And then you go and do some prayers for the weeds you just pulled or whatever. But he's saying, all you have to do is say, geez, kid, I'm sorry about that. And maybe that's a prayer in itself. Could be. But I really like that one because it's rather controversial, I think, when you come across those kinds of situations. Even pulling vegetables in your vegetable garden. You just killed it. Then you're going to freaking eat it. Sorry, kid. Nothing personal. I just like the humor in that. Maybe that's just my weirdness. But definitely something to think about, particularly if one has a strong, immediate reaction to it. Definitely something to think about then.
I love that because that keeps me not asleep. That keeps me awake. When I'm going through my garden, I'm paying attention. That is for me what he means. Paying attention to the present moment is what I can do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he has a sense of humor about this.
Yes.
The Jains in India walk around with masks on so they don't inhale any bugs, and they're utterly serious about that. I'm not denigrating that approach at all, but realistically, we're going to kill things, and Jen Cox seems to have some humor about that, but also a respect for life.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely not a callousness towards life. It's not a disregard for life. Okay, next one. This is a good one. Next, you should say the opposite of what you chemically feel. For example, perhaps you are walking down the street and you see a beer can thrown on the ground. And inside you, the people immediately rise up, muttering about the crude curs and dolts that ride through life throwing beer cans around. If that's what you're wired up chemically to feel about the situation, then you should say just the opposite. Say, oh boy, isn't it great that somebody had fun and drank a beer? Wow, they must have really had fun to sling those cans around like that. Or say, hey, isn't it great that they were smart enough to throw it out the window instead of messing up their car? Or taking it home and messing up their house. It doesn't matter if what you say seems ridiculous, as long as it's something more or less opposite to what you are chemically feeling at the moment. Someone drives by and shouts an insult at you. Say to yourself, boy, isn't it good that person isn't deaf and dumb? Don't they have a nice voice? Isn't it good they could holler at me instead of going home all tensed up and maybe beating their wife or child? Use your imagination. Besides, the funnier it is, the harder it is for you to get caught up with feeling serious about your feelings. That was the punchline. Taking our feelings seriously. So the saying of the opposite of what we're feeling has a tendency to short circuit that investment in the feeling or the rigidity of the feeling, because, of course, the way I feel about it is right. My feelings are always right. How could I question them? Don't question them. I actually toyed with this a little bit. It's something you can do as a little experiment on yourself. I mean, doesn't everybody just love to experiment on themselves? Do little things like this. You're down on the square, and there are those supporters out there, 2024. And gee, it's really nice that they feel comfortable expressing themselves, isn't it? Isn't that a wonderful thing? It's good stuff, this little exercise. He uses an example of a negative reaction we might have to something. He uses the example of seeing somebody littering, throwing a beer can out the window. And we have a negative reaction. But what about positive reactions? What about when we have a positive reaction? Doesn't it come from the same place? Isn't it just the other end of the spectrum of conditioning? And perhaps should be just as questionable as what we feel in the negative sense? I think so. That's my personal opinion. That everything is questionable. I haven't done that experiment yet. Saying the opposite when what I might term positive reactions show up. Actually, I think I do that anyway. Somebody says something about peace and love, and I go, that's a crock of shit.
Well, that would be your chemical reaction.
Yes, to say the opposite, right, would be to go along with them. So, yeah, that is beautiful. Yeah, my chemical reaction is to go, that's a crock of shit. And I'm right? The sway those feelings have. They make me feel right every time. He calls it chemical reactions. Chemistry is a powerful thing in the body. You should be thinking, I hope I pass the test whenever anyone apparently causes you to be angry. You may recall my earlier comments on this. If you're in a position where you suddenly feel either superior or angry, you should immediately consider that life is testing you to see whether you're still the same old Charlie that can be thrown to the ground by the same old kinds of influences, whatever they may be for you personally. You should consider when something negative in you rises up from the chemical level to the electrical level being the thinking level. You should treat the situation at that instant as though you are the lowest witted person on the planet. Act as though there are secret forces of life out there who arrange things periodically to trip people up, just to see how they are coming along. You should consider yourself to be so far down the evolutionary ladder right now that life tests you more than once, maybe once a week. I hope I pass the test when anyone apparently causes you to be angry. And then he later added, or superior.
So what would that be to pass the test?
To have a realistic view of yourself. To have a realistic view of yourself in relationship to being insulted or made angry. Having a realistic view of yourself as a mechanical entity. That's the test. Consider it like, here's another test. I love the way he said it. He says, life is testing you to see whether you're still the same old Charlie that can be thrown to the ground by the same old kinds of influences. It's like, damn, she got me again. She said that thing and it just pissed me off. Again, third time this month, thrown to the ground. Another test. No big deal. No need to beat yourself up. It's just a test. How are you doing with that little thing that keeps throwing you to the ground? And maybe to pass the test is to no longer be thrown to the ground. Not that you wouldn't get angry. To not feel things like that might mean you're becoming a block of wood. But To be thrown to the ground is a whole different thing. So it's possible to feel angry, to feel superior without being thrown to the ground. And my interpretation of being thrown to the ground is being distracted from your involvement in this.
So to respond in an opposite way than you're chemically motivated
Mm-hmm.
would be an expression of passing the test, so to speak. You're not at the effect of the same kind of influences.
Yeah.
Even if those feelings come up.
Yeah.
That is revolutionist.
Yeah.
Who lives like that?
I don't know.
Well, it just seems that people on the path, really on the path, have a sense of the importance of being able to do that rather than just mechanically respond.
Yes, but my comment was about would anybody notice? And it doesn't matter to me whether anybody notices that or not. Oh, look, he's such a revolutionary. Thank you very much. It may be better off that nobody notices. That gets done, that revolutionary work gets done, but maybe nobody notices. And another thing I was thinking about being a revolutionist just has to do with the word revolution, like the revolution of a wheel. It's simply the turning of a wheel, full revolution, full circle. It might have nothing to do with taking down the establishment. It might be a little simpler than that. By the establishment, I don't mean the schools or the government. I mean this establishment, me, as an establishment, as an institution. Okay, next one. You should have no interest in other people's personal lives. Oh my God, how is that even possible? That's asking a hell of a lot. This is related to something else I've mentioned, that you should have no heroes. You're not capable of picturing a hero. I know you think you are, but you're not. Anyone that ordinary consciousness can imagine as a hero is not a hero. What can be imagined is just this sort of 3D invention of the gods all over again. Man takes his own inbred genetic molecular weaknesses, the parts that are missing, the parts that by being missing make man what he is, and creates a hero out of those parts. All gossip, whether it's between you and a friend or just reading a popular magazine about film stars, is unprofitable action for those pursuing this. It's not wrong because it's culturally unseemly. Rather, it's molecularly poisonous to spend time and energy daydreaming about someone else's personal life. Ask yourself this: what have I ever gained, really, from such daydreaming? The answer is nothing. Worse than nothing, because it's a poisonous, continual molecular reinforcement of the structures of non-existent heroes. Such reinforcement allows you to continue in your feelings of impotence. You are wired up to imagine that someone else has more power than you through luck, birth, position, or effort. Listen, there is nobody on the perceivable horizon, historically or coevally, worthy of this kind of attention from you, much less your adoration. Nobody. For ordinary people, gossip and hero worship are important stuff, holding the fabric of life together. For you, it's poison. So that's pretty revolutionary. When you think of social media and how prolific and prevalent social media is in our lives, and how much that involves other people's personal lives, Facebook is a poison because of that, because of what he's talking about here. And I really like this thing he said: man takes his own inbred genetic molecular weaknesses. And he has weaknesses in quotes, because my weaknesses are only from my perspective. what I perceive as my weaknesses. They may not actually be weaknesses. For all I know, they could be strengths. The parts that are missing, the parts that by being missing make man what he is and creates a hero out of those parts. What he's saying is our heroes are made up primarily of the parts that are missing. I see these weaknesses and somebody else doesn't have them. They have the strengths and go, oh, my hero. I look at somebody like Werner Erhard, my hero, because he's so dynamic and he speaks so well and his use of language is so pristine. And besides, at 85, he's really good looking. So he's my hero. But it might get tricky when we get into spiritual heroes. All the great saints and sages that we might have as heroes. I want to be like Ramana Maharshi or somebody like that. I want to be like my teacher. I want to be like my guru, my hero. What he's talking about is the weaknesses we see in ourselves, and we want to mold our heroes out of those weaknesses we have. Very interesting way of looking at it. I never really thought of that until I read this. And I also think there's a distinction between having a hero and having honor and respect for someone. I think there's a great distinction in that as well. But it seems very clear that the hero is something very specific that he's addressing.
But I get it. We tend to, as human beings, idealize people, put them on a pedestal. And what you're saying is that a lot of that comes from seeing outside of us the missing parts of ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, the missing parts are the weaknesses. But he says this very interesting thing in here. We take our own inbred genetic molecular weaknesses, the parts that are missing, the parts that by being missing make man what he is. So those parts that are missing, those weaknesses, they make me who I am. Somehow, the way he writes that, I relate to the necessity of embracing those weaknesses, those missing parts, or at least being okay with them, rather than seeing that as some sort of failure on my part, and thus need to create a hero out of it. Because that's who I am. That's what makes me up. It's not all that makes me up, I hope, the weaknesses, but he's saying those weaknesses is what makes a man who he is, or she, or they. I won't get into that. You should have no electrified opinion. He has this cosmology of circuitry. He's got a blue circuit, a red circuit, and a yellow circuit. The yellow circuit is the mental circuit, the thinking circuit. Also, he calls it the electrical circuit. So you should have no electrified opinions concerning race, nationality, culture, etc. I know these, quote, prejudices are built into humanity. They're there for good reason. In ordinary life, there's a real basis to feeling nationalistic. It's not just rednecks standing on the corner down in Alabama, or people who cry when the American flag goes by, or people who holler, hey, let's run everybody out of the country that wasn't born here. There's a reality to all these opinions. They're not culturally learned. Let me remind you again, there's no such thing as cultural, nor is it environmentally learned. There's a built-in hereditary basis to the hostility one race feels towards another. There's even an inborn basis for the tension between the sexes, although rather than hostility, a better description would be the tension between dominant and submissive forces. Nevertheless, all racialistic, nationalistic, and chauvinistic feelings have a molecular, built-in basis, and they serve a purpose out there in ordinary life. The French against the Germans against the Jews, and the Jews against the Arabs. You know all the stories. Prejudice is necessary to help keep life going. But for the real revolutionary, these feelings of superiority are another form of poison. I'm personally delighted to be living in this country, and I don't know of any reason why I should move from it. But to let this feeling pass from the chemical to the electrical, to somehow be proud of being white, black, Jewish, Christian, American, French, Spanish, that is poison. The real revolutionist has no allegiance, none. He cannot have any. Any allegiance to the limited perceptions of the ordinary world is a form of slavery. Slavery to your genes. Whoa. Funny that I was going to say that's really deep, because genes are pretty deep. It's one thing not to be a slave to your habits, your food habits, or your sleep habits, or your habits of speech, but slavery to your genes. He's talking about all these prejudices. He's talking about them not at the level of environment or cultural. He's talking about the level of genetics. I'm not going to pretend that I understand that like 100%, because I don't think I do. But I do understand what he's talking about in terms of being a revolutionary and not being at the effect of that, or at least attempting not to be. Like he's saying, having no allegiance to being white, black, Jewish, Christian, American, French, Spanish, or even no allegiance to age or gen this or gen that.
It sounds like what he's talking about is going against nature.
Yeah. If you're talking about not being a slave to your genes, you're talking about going against nature.
What is stronger than that? Than your genes? Why would you do that?
He talks about slavery to your genes. So maybe it's just seeing that, and that's not what I want to be doing. Being a slave to my genes. Maybe that's the powerful thing. Seeing that I don't want to be a slave to my genes.
And why not? You probably have to have some serious reason to go against that.
Well, because I'll tell you why. He's talking about a lot of prejudices and biases here. And I have found myself through my life living those. Pretty much all of them that he's talking about. They don't work. That's not a great way to live. So what's stronger than that? What's stronger is the urge not to live that way.
But it seems like not fighting against your urges, making friends with them, is also an important possibility.
Yeah, I agree. A few years before my dad died, so this was maybe 10 or 12 years ago, I'm visiting him in his house. And, there's all kinds of family around. But somehow he and I ended up in the living room. We're in the house. We're the only ones there. And we're in this conversation that involves jokes, denigration about every category of people you can think of. And I'm completely embarrassed. And that was the thing that occurred to me. At the time, I was laughing hysterically, and I'm going, oh, this is me. So the acceptance of that is what started. I had to admit, yeah, there you are, in living color. And it's not going away. You can't dig that out, with a shovel. I don't think. That's been my experience, because I've tried. And I don't think that works. So I think a deep acceptance of where I'm standing right now is what works. Oh, here's a good one. Don't ever talk about health, wealth, or age. So this is the Revolutionist Code of Conduct. Many of those who get involved with this activity remain healthy and here. Whereas if they had been left to their own devices elsewhere, they would be numbered either among the dead or the living, walking dead. These same people understand some of my reasons behind this item on my list because I literally told them, whatever your problem is, don't ever talk about it again. It has an effect. Approaching 40, don't talk about it. Yeah, I know. There's a molecular basis for the middle-aged crazies in both men and women. But if you want to remain ultimately healthy, don't talk about it. Don't worry over it. Don't electrify it. I gave you the immediate treatment, which is simply forget it. Don't put words to it, and it will take care of itself. Other people may go through that sort of craziness for years, but once it hits you, you can get over it in a matter of weeks, maybe days. If age is the item and you hit 40, don't think about it. Don't feel sorry for yourself. Don't conjure up pictures of all the things that you think you've missed in life. It's a real feeling, but it's strictly a chemical feeling. Don't drag it out and poison yourself by making it electrical. That won't help and could hurt you a great deal. Even talking in general about your health is a sort of poison. I don't mean for you to be ridiculous about it. Don't volunteer to carry refrigerators around if you've just hurt your back. All you've got to say if someone should ask for refrigerator help is, I hurt my back. Or if you've got the flu and you've got to tell someone here in order to avoid injuring yourself, all you have to say is, I can't, I've got the flu. Everyone here will understand, and there'll be no more said or expected of you. Outside of here, do whatever will cause you the least problem. But don't discuss your health with anyone but your doctor, and then only if you really need to. Don't discuss your wealth either. That is, don't discuss your position in the financial order of things. Don't engage in conversations at the checkout line on the basis of, yeah, I know, prices have gone up all over and I can hardly make it. Don't discuss your finances with anybody, even your family. When it comes to health, age, and wealth, just don't play. I don't care if you're stooped over and look like you're 80. If someone says, God, it's hell to be 50, isn't it? Just look off like you don't know what 50 is, or 80 either. I'm telling you, don't play. You ever heard of the term an organ recital? That's what old people do when they talk about their health. They give organ recitals. Oh, my liver had this, my heart that, my kidneys this, my prostate. It's an organ recital. Great term. So, health, wealth, and age. Getting old isn't for sissies, you know? It's so hard and I can't do what I used to do. Don't play.
Why is that detrimental, aside from being annoying?
Because it gives undue attention to something that will take care of itself in one way or another. And what we do with our attention is important. So if our attention is going into an organ recital, we could be externally quiet. We could be saying a prayer, doing something different with our attention, and simply nodding our head to everybody else in the circle who's giving their organ recital. We go, But inside, our attention is elsewhere.